Last week, the studio shut down, as we all know, because we're on here now. We lost the opportunity to do our reviews, to get feedback from our peers and tutors on our project, and the experience of presenting for the Viva. My mentor Sophia asked our tutor group to send our presentations for written feedback instead. I hadn't made a presentation due to the shutdown, and I found it really hard to try and make one for the new deadline for us, which was Sunday. So instead I sent Sophia what is now the script of this video, which is everything I would have said if we did have a face-to-face review. The PDF I sent Sophia didn't include any pictures, it was just a really long written words. To build on that and to kind of take back the format of a review, I thought I would film myself presenting it and invite, request, plead for those watching for some feedback. I'll put my Goldsmiths email and my design Instagram at the end of this video for anyone who wants to feedback to me directly, because I'd really appreciate that. Thanks in advance, and here we go. Also, just before I start, apologies that I keep looking away. I'm reading everything from the screen. At the beginning of the project, I had a collection of things. Some things I collected from the floor in Deptford, pictures of a Vietnamese supermarket and an estate agent with exactly the same signs, some American gossip magazines, and a collection of feminist retellings of Greek mythology. I had an amorphous working methodology. I thought the amorphous and this collection of objects was what my project topic was going to be. But it's not. I was wrong. They aren't in it in the sense that I originally thought, but I've now realised they're still an integral part of my project. I think something must be said for the work of the subconscious. My own seems to have pieced together parts that I'd originally disregarded in favour for what I thought was a new and completely different project. So now at the end, well, nearing the end, everything is kind of falling into place a little bit. The amorphous methodology I wanted to focus on and discuss has become my process. The objects I wanted to focus on have led me to new objects, new discoveries, all by being investigated in a different lens. So this lens is my project topic, which is lying objects. Throughout the project, I learned how broad the term lying objects is. Deception can come in many forms with different intentions or completely by accident. I've learned about how the objects can be designed to lie, but also some people might not consider them lying. The intricacies of this are what I think the project's really about, and how it's interesting to discover those tensions through learning more and investigating objects, how they were designed, what they were made of, in what context they were made. Really what this project has become is almost evidence to support the work of Foucault and his ideas about discourse and archaeology of knowledge. There are layers to an object's deception that can be uncovered through its history, materiality, and its intended purpose. Initially, these layers were not something I considered part of my investigation. I was looking in a very flat sense, like a 2D yes or no, true or false. I was looking at empirical truth, inspired by David Hume's fallacy of induction. I thought I could just put right objects by redesigning them to reveal their lives, to make them true. I could fix them. I would be removing a lie from the world and easing the world of the problem of post-truth induced anxiety. To do this, I picked some objects, I researched, I redesigned, I repackaged them to tell the truth. Lies cause anxiety and instability, and they're the enemy of movement. This can be seen whenever there is debate, whenever there's crisis, whenever important decisions are being made. You see it right now with the coronavirus. So politics, and particularly the public's response to any kind of major event, highlight this immensely. So no one truly knows the right answer, so instead of making decisions with fact, we come up with our own measures to work out who is most trustworthy. There are 3 objects I looked at: bags for life, some small collectible toys, and the blue willow pattern. The bag for life, they were introduced to the public as a plastic saving initiative. However, it is not all as it seems. They've actually increased plastic usage because they require more plastic to be made, as they're intended to be reusable. However, they aren't reused enough to counteract this increase in plastic. So overall, there is actually more plastic being used than before. So to respond to this, I adapted the bag for life. Customers are given the blame for using the plastic bags that are supplied for them, and for the kind of effects that plastic is having in the environment, when suppliers have the choice to work on this and help consumers sort it out. So my slogan was printed on the top of an original bag in a very similar aesthetic. Deptford collectibles, that's now object number 2. So souvenirs and small collectible toys are sold to people as a must-have. Yeah, I found mine on the floor, abandoned. One even walked by being run over by a car. Not exactly the life cycle that would be expected of something valuable. Yet we're still told we need them. The consumerist system is something in Situation This International wanted to rebel against, as people were conned out of their hard-earned money for something they didn't need and most of the time probably didn't want. To highlight this in my design, I repackaged the items as if they were back on the shelves, but instead of using the usual sales spiel, I replaced it with a written stream of consciousness and a realistic retelling of what would happen to their objects. The intent here was to highlight how ridiculous it is for people to be buying into it. They were made through vacuum forming and graphically designing the backboards. The third and final object is Blue Willow pattern that depicts a story of an emperor and his daughter. It was hugely popular when it was created in the 1800s up to today, and it uses a chinoiserie kind of aesthetic. So what is less known about it is that it comes from Stoke-on-Trent and originated around the time of the Opium War. The use of the Chinese imitation design was to get people to buy from English firms rather than abroad, as that and a newfound love of tea was causing a huge financial deficit, eventually solved by the East India Trading Company by illegally selling opiates through India to China. This story is not the story that's depicted on the plate. So I redrew the design and printed it onto the plates that I got from IKEA. It worked really well. I got a really good response. So all of the objects arrived to me in different ways. The bag for life was inspired by a disgruntled environmentalist conversations and a chance news story that I saw on television. The Deptford collectibles were literally things I came across when I was walking around Deptford. The Willow pattern idea came to me when I was investigating the supermarket and the estate agents with the same sign. I ended up on a blog about Southeast Asia and Asian supermarkets in the UK. As well as food, I started to think about other things I've come across from different countries that have been taken by the UK as if they were its own, kind of in the same way food has, with that anglifying of different cuisines from different countries have been for the takeaway market. So that's how I came across the Willow pattern. None of these were found through a process of linear research. They all appeared in different forms but have impacted the project hugely. This is the amorphous subconscious aspect of my process. Being a sponge and open to influences from all places, whether it be the floor by the side of the road or a food blog. Once I'd created the projects, they sat on my desk. I was unsure of how to activate them in the world. To explore this, I created the Museum of Truth. I presented all the objects as objects that would reveal the true story of a recognisable object, with the aim of educating anyone who came to the museum to ease this post-truth anxiety. This is what I presented at the work in progress. So at the WIP, I learnt a great deal. I did at the time feel like it was a bit of a waste because people weren't engaging with my project in the way that I'd anticipated they would. People weren't picking up the objects and reading the back of the Deptford collectibles. Someone even wrote on the little feedback cards I did that they didn't realise it was a museum. Some of the feedback I got was that the objects didn't sit well together, the museum aesthetic wasn't great, but I think overall it was a success. I'll explain why in a moment. Social media and the internet works like an echo chamber for confusion, as well as the so-called facts. There are quotations, misquotations, interpretations, opinions, and they all multiply at an exponential rate. To spend the time to decipher each of them and work out what is actually true is potentially futile. Yet another reason why the Museum of Truth might not work as well as I'd intended. This helplessness and the unknown immobilizes people. How can anyone make the right choices if they don't know what they're basing their choices on is actually true? What was a success, however, was that I realised I wanted the objects to be used, for them to be engaged with, to really activate them and allow them to tell their story. The object that people liked most from the museum was the plate. So the plates featured the pattern that I had redesigned. So I presented two of them together at the WIP. One was very similar to the original, just with the knotted illustration placed in instead of the real one. And the other was a more abstract use of the leftover decals I had that I'd put onto the plates. Interestingly, the more abstract plate was successful. People were more interested, perhaps because it fit more with a modern taste rather than the original Victorian kind of taste that the first one was designed to suit. And with this in mind, I thought I'd focus on that one going forward. I wanted to reduce my workload and go depth rather than breadth, particularly as this was the strongest object that had come from the WIP. Bearing in mind, I still wanted to activate the object rather than it being in a clinical setting. I wanted to put it to use. Using the more abstract design and then interested in alternate storytelling, I decided I wanted to make a tea set or a dinner set. The design would be split across different parts of crockery to use an alternate method of storytelling and activate the design with it an activity that fit the original lying object's material properties. So I reflected on the original plates that I'd made. Although I had a good feedback, I wasn't sure they actually counted as a truthful or confessional object. The plate I'd made wasn't an original willow pattern with a print on top of it. It was just an IKEA plate. So the true story of the plate wasn't the true story of that plate. What I'd done was actually make another lying object. On this object was another completely irrelevant story. So in order to make a truthful piece of pottery, I'd have to make it myself so I could tell the whole story and not make yet another lying object. I'd also have to draw myself into the illustration and explain my process in this. Before university shut down, I began experimenting with different ways of making the set and which would be the best way of doing it. I'd been watching the Great Pottery Throwdown, which was great for learning new techniques actually about ceramics, and kind of in my brain allowed me to work out which ways might be a good way of doing it for me. I wanted to make a Victorian dinner set. Dinners are often a time for talking, catching up and telling stories. If I could have a dinner discussing the willow pattern using illustrated crockery as a way of explaining the truth, then the redesigned objects would be activated. The set would include all the crockery that would have been used in a traditional Victorian dinner. I then researched who would have been buying the willow pattern originally, what they would have been eating, and all about the dining taxonomy at the time. I did this by looking at housekeeping and dining books, which have formed the basis of recipe books that we use today. To create the set, I originally thought slip casting would be the best way of doing this. However, to make the plaster moulds required to do this would take 2 weeks to dry, taking away valuable production time. Little did I know that that would be the least of my worries. To solve that, I intended to use pre-made moulds, not entirely ideal because of how I explained earlier, the lying not showing the whole story of the object. I had to draw the line of doing it myself at some point, or else I would have had to go down to the Thames, dig up my own clay, work out the geology and explain on the illustration how the rocks are formed. If I had the time, I would love to do that, and that's kind of what I mean about the archaeology of knowledge. As I'm researching and making, I'm discovering layer upon layer of interactions and connections with the plate. In geography, layers of rock are called strata, and I think these are different strata of knowledge that we're seeing with each object being investigated more, but that's straying from the point a little bit. The moulds were allowing me to slip cast, so I did some practice slip casts and moulds around the labs, see how the process was going to work before I ordered some. I made 2 bowls and a cool geometric plant pot. I spent a lot of time in the ceramics labs doing this and played around with other processes. One that I got shown was the 3D potter, and this is now my favourite ever thing. I became a little bit obsessed with this and got really positive feedback from one of the first things that I made. I love the laser cutter, I love Rhino, and I love doing a similar process with a more malleable material, and I found that really exciting. So I realised that I could actually make things a lot quicker than I would have been able to with slip casting, and I wouldn't have needed to get all the moulds, so I would have made the whole thing myself. The 3D potter also is more interesting and potentially more relevant to my project because, as I was saying about strata before, the way the pottery is printed, it creates layers, strata, so that could be a nice visual representation of the kind of the archaeology of knowledge happening in the piece as well. I began thinking about how I could use this new technique to make the dinner set, but due to the way the printing works, it's impossible more or less to make plates because there's nothing being printed underneath because of the wide angle, so it would just essentially fall flat. So the bowls and the plates at the angles I wanted wouldn't be possible. As well as thinking about a dinner set, I thought about doing a tea set. Tea is closely linked to the origin of the story of the willow pattern. Making a tea set would be a more feasible thing to do because of the shapes with the 3D potter. This was exciting and I began working on it immediately. I printed the lid and the base of my first attempt of a teapot, but then the shutdown happened. Whilst I was experimenting with the crockery and ceramics, I was also thinking about the other designed objects that would be involved in a dinner party or a tea party that I could use to tell the story. One particular item was serviettes. I wanted to continue the use of appropriated or borrowed crafts. I looked at the Chinese paper folding. I wanted my serviette to be folded nicely into boats to reflect the motif from the plate. I would also have on them an explanation of the story. Think of it as the text that goes in the book as well, and the illustrations of the ceramics. I began to experiment with this, prototyping the boats to work out different bits of information, where the bits of information would go to be placed on the unfolded serviette. So I got the desired effect when folded, but also that it looked good when it was laid flat. And then obviously the shutdown hub. I think I'll stop here, as this is where my review would have stopped. I'm aware this is probably a really long video for people to watch, but I would still like to share my next steps with you all, and I will aim to do that as a target for next week.